Relativism. Relativism is a response to absolutism. It's pretty much the polar opposite of absolutism. And it states that there is no objective right and wrong with respect to beliefs, norms, and behaviors, and that diversity is an indication of this. In other words, and furthermore, we cannot judge the rightness and wrongness of beliefs, norms, behaviors, except from within the context within which, except within the context of the culture within which those beliefs, norms, behaviors occur. This is what I call a weak relativism. A stronger version of relativism would say that we cannot judge the rightness and wrongness of beliefs, norms, behaviors, period. Person to person, within our own life, let alone culture to culture. And again, like all ethical theories, all theories, period, there are advantages and disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses to relativism. One advantage is that there is no need to figure out or establish objective principles of right and wrong. That is a relief, because that is a very difficult thing, and it is probably something many would say is impossible. So not having to do that is an advantage. Another advantage is that it seems like it would lead to tolerance, because if I say that, well, I can't judge the rightness and wrongness of someone else's culture, their moral beliefs, then I'm more tolerant of them. This is another one that has kind of a caveat, though, because on page 186 in the S textbook, Digital Media Ethics, they go over a discussion of how relativism is kind of an isolationist position, in that if I say that, well, I can judge what goes on in my culture because it's my culture, the rightness and wrongness of beliefs, norms, and behaviors, and say, this is right and this is wrong for us, but not for them. I can say, well, it's wrong for in our culture, despite the fact that our military has done it in the past, to target innocent civilians. It doesn't mean that it's wrong for other cultures. It doesn't mean that it's wrong for Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda, has their own culture, and they believe it's okay to target innocent civilians and old people and children and pregnant women. So I can't take a moral stance on that. That's their business. This creates a kind of isolationism where, if I say live and let live, they do their thing, we do our thing, there isn't a dialogue. And sometimes to have dialogue, you have to have confrontation. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about pluralism. So that kind of is a segue into disadvantages, because that could be considered a disadvantage. Some other disadvantages are, one, if everyone must practice tolerance, doesn't that make tolerance a universal principle itself? I don't think this is a very strong argument against relativism. I think it could, because people that take on these theoretical orientations seriously, and that are serious philosophers and thinkers, they're not stupid. They work out arguments for it, and so they would probably say, well, if you want to call it a universal principle, that's fine. It would be more accurate to say that because of the tolerant nature of relativism, that's just something that's common in relativistic ethics, that you tolerate other cultures. But that principle itself is relativistic, and it is non-judgmental, and so that is the core of relativism. So I don't see that as being a huge argument against it. It just seems to be, on the face of it, a contradiction. That, well, if there are no universal principles of right and wrong, and you say tolerance is a kind of universal, then you're contradicting yourself. But there are ways around that, as I just pointed out. Another problem is that there do seem to be very common views on right and wrong from culture to culture. So if the basis of relativism is the observation that there is diversity from culture to culture, then wouldn't seeing common views of right and wrong between cultures indicate that there is at least a suggestion that there are moral principles of right and wrong that are in some sense universal? So it seems like that's a little bit stronger of a case against relativism. Another one that Charles S. points out in Digital Media Ethics on page 185 is he sees relativism as committing the affirming the consequent fallacy. And I talked about a lot of fallacies in the Writing Critical Thought and Analysis lecture, and this is one I didn't cover because I knew I'd be covering it in this lecture. I'm going to go over this, and then I'm going to show that you might be able to get around this fallacy, but ultimately there is still a problem with the relativist argument. So affirming the consequent follows this logical format. It's if P, then Q. Q, therefore P. If you're not used to formal logic or informal logic and in this type of thinking, then that might sound strange to you, and you might think, what's the problem with that? And even when I give you an example showing how it works, it may not seem like it's a problem, because fallacies tend to sound right. That's why they're common. That's why they've been identified and kind of categorized. So again, affirming the consequent. Let's look at an example of the relativist argument, demonstrating that it's potentially committing the affirming the consequent fallacy. If there is no universal right and wrong, P, we can expect to find diverse values and beliefs, Q. We do find diverse values and beliefs, Q. Therefore, there is no universal right and wrong, P. The problem with this is that when you have a conditional, an if-then statement, you can't conclude the if from the then. So you can't conclude the P from the Q. You can only infer the Q from the P. If P, then Q. So if you have a P, then you can conclude that there's a Q, but you can't conclude that there's a P if you have Q. And I know this is really confusing to people that aren't familiar with this. So let's look at more examples. This always helps me understand all things a lot better. Here's an example that's totally unrelated to information technology ethics. If I like Snooki, then there are Snooki posters on my bedroom wall. There are Snooki posters on my bedroom wall. Therefore, I like Snooki. You see, again, the then part comes before the if part. You can't put the then before the if. The if has to come before the then in order to have a valid argument, to have a conclusion that follows from the premises. So why? If I like Snooki, then there are Snooki posters on my bedroom wall. There are Snooki posters on my bedroom wall. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that I like Snooki, because for one thing, what if I have a roommate that really likes Jersey Shore and I hate Jersey Shore, and I in particular really hate Snooki? I can still have Snooki posters on my bedroom wall and not like Snooki. So that shows the problem with that line of reasoning. I think that you can try to salvage the relativist argument by changing it to the valid counterpart of affirming the consequence, which is modus ponens. Remember, a valid argument is one in which if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. So modus ponens goes like this: if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Remember, I was saying that. If you have a conditional like that, you say if P, then Q, you can conclude Q if P is the case. So let's look at Snooki again. If Snooki is awesome, then I like Snooki. Snooki is awesome, therefore I like Snooki. That's a valid argument because it's necessary that I like Snooki if it's the case that Snooki is awesome and that I like Snooki if Snooki is awesome. So let's go back to the relativist argument in the modus ponens form. If there is diversity, there is no objective right and wrong. There is diversity. Therefore, there is no objective right and wrong. Again, a valid argument. So it's logically sound, but when it comes, or no, I'm sorry, that is incorrect. It is not logically sound. It is logically valid. It is not. It is logically unsound, though. I think, because I think the first premise is incorrect. And remember, soundness is validity with true premises. If the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises and the premises are true, then the argument is sound. I think that premise 1 is incorrect. If there is diversity, there is no objective right and wrong. Because there could very well be diversity and still be objective right and wrong. An absolutist would say that, of course there's diversity. It's just everybody's wrong that doesn't conform to the set of the universal set of standards of right and wrong. They're just immoral. And there are a few other kind of strong arguments against, or strong weaknesses with strong disadvantages of relativism. One is that it leads to prima facie wrong conclusions, conclusions that just on their face just seem obviously wrong. For example, the situation I talked about with targeting innocent civilians. It seems just very difficult to be able to justify a relativist position when you aren't able to say that Al-Qaeda targeting pregnant women and children and old people is wrong. It seems like you should be able to do that under an ethical theory. An ethical theory that does not allow one to do that is insufficient. And this goes the other way. If I can't say that, Charles S. uses this is an example, and so to make it politically correct, sort of, I want to set it up a little differently. Let's suppose none of us are Catholic. Even if you are Catholic, suppose none of us are Catholic, and we're talking about Mother Teresa, and we see that Mother Teresa helped the poorest of the poor, and assume that only Catholics believe that helping the poorest of the poor is a morally good thing to do. We can't say from our culture that what Mother Teresa did was a good thing because, well, in her culture, yeah, it's a good thing, but we're not in any position to say that what she does is right or wrong. It seems like you should be able to say that what Mother Teresa did was a good thing, regardless of your theoretical outlook, and so that's a big problem with relativism. And finally, this goes back to the issue of tolerance and isolationism. In the digital age, if we can't judge the rightness and wrongness of beliefs and values and behaviors of other cultures, how can we establish any kind of meaningful ethical system when so many different cultures interact? I mean, if we're sharing markets and sharing, intercontinental communication and international legal cooperation, if everybody just says, well, whatever you do is fine for you and whatever we do is fine for us, that isolationism is not going to establish a globalist digital ethics. It's not going to give us a playing field on which we can work together to establish laws, to establish boundaries, to get compensation, to communicate and agree to disagree. So that's relativism.